Okay, so here is my summary of 2.9, the role of the Victorian Law Reform Commission, known as the VLRC. And yes, you can just write VLRC in SAC and exam responses. And 2.10 is you need to learn a recent example of the VLRC recommending law reform. And our skill here, our reminder, is that we are evaluating. So you're going to need to know strengths and weaknesses. So a strength of the VLRC being able to recommend law reform, and a weakness concerning the VLRC being able to recommend law reform. All right, so the reason for the VLRC. Why do we have the VLRC? Members of Parliament often lack the time and resources to undertake a thorough investigation of an issue. In situations like this, parliaments may prefer to pass the investigation of the need for law reform to an independent law reform body that can conduct its own investigations and make recommendations for changes to the law. So the parliaments do have, Victorian Parliament does have the committee system, the Senate committee system, and they can do lots of investigating. But if a particular issue is quite large and they know it's going to take a lot of time, they might decide to send it to an expert body to do that work for them. And the VLRC is one of the ones in Victoria. So the VLRC is Victoria's leading independent law reform organisation, which reviews, researches and makes recommendations to the Parliament of Victoria about possible changes to Victoria's law. So let's be very clear here. The V stands for Victoria. So when you are talking about the VLRC, you are only talking about Victoria's Parliament. You are not talking about the Commonwealth Parliament. There is an ALRC, Australian Law Reform Commission, that is the Commonwealth Parliament's go-to, but in the study design, it specifically states that you must study the VLRC, okay? So remember, the V stands for Victoria and only refer to the Victorian Parliament. Do not refer to the Commonwealth Parliament when discussing the VLRC. The VLRC aims to provide a fair, inclusive and accessible legal system by investigating the need for change in Victorian laws and providing the government with impartial advice and recommendations for change. So already there you will have picked up, I hope, on a strength of the VLRC, and that is that the advice that it gives the Parliament is impartial. There is no political bias involved with the VLRC. So what is the role? Okay, the VLRC is an independent body, so that continues on that theme of impartiality. It was set up by the government through the Victorian Law Reform Commission Act in the year 2000, but it is independent. There are no politicians, parliamentarians involved with the VLRC. It's a completely independent body from the Parliament. The VLRC monitors and coordinates law reform activity in Victoria. It investigates and advises the Victorian government on ways to update and improve the Victorian law. It engages in community-wide consultation and debate. This is important because it ensures recommendations for change to the law meet the needs and desires of the Victorian community. And if you recall, one of our reasons for law reform, one of our reasons is that laws need to reflect what the community wants. And it also undertakes educational programs and informs the community on any areas of the law relevant to its investigations or references. So it investigates, advises, consults with the community, recommends, and runs educational programs. So what is the process? I think the poster you've got, it's got 11 steps, and the booklet's got 10 steps. I have shortened it down to 7 steps. First step, it undertakes initial research and consultation with experts in the law under review to identify the most important issues. Second step, it publishes a consultation paper to explain key issues in the area under review, poses questions about what aspects of the law should be changed and how And this consultation paper is for the community to start considering. Is this a topic that I want to be involved in? Is this exactly the kind of law reform I've been looking for, and therefore I'm going to make a submission? It then holds consultations and discussions. Sometimes it travels around the Victoria to discuss things that are pertinent to particular communities. And of course, you can write a submission. So it holds consultations, discussions, and invites submissions from parties who are affected by the area under review and members of the Victorian community. And that may include interested individuals, pressure groups, organisations, in particular people from marginalised groups such as those from non-English speaking backgrounds, people with disabilities, Indigenous people, and people living in remote communities. So using the recent changes to law to allow for medicinal cannabis, the kind of people that they spoke to, the VLRC consulted with, were medical professionals, pain relief professionals, parents of children who suffered epilepsy, epilepsy support groups, all those kinds of people. They're the people they wanted to hear from and find out what the views were from those different groups. Okay, then it asks experts to research areas requiring any further information. It then publishes a report with its recommendations for changes in the law, and then finally the report is given to the Attorney General, and the Attorney General then tables the report in the Victorian Parliament, and that is a must. The Attorney General cannot ignore the report. The report must be tabled in Parliament. Then Parliament can choose to ignore it if it wants to, but it must be tabled. So Parliament then decides whether to implement some or all of the VLRC's recommendations by incorporating them into a bill, but it is not bound to do so. And of course, when it says Parliament decides, it's the government that decides if that's the way it wants to go, because as we know, the government has the majority of seats in the lower house, so it sets the agenda. So it's the government deciding whether they want to go through with what the VLRC is recommending. Okay, so back to step 6, the Attorney General receives the report, and the Attorney General must table the report in Victorian Parliament, but the Parliament or the government is not bound to act on the report. And this is really important to remember, because this mistake is made every year, either in the SAC or in exams. The VLRC does not actually enact legislative reform. Okay, the VLRC does not make the changes. Only Parliament can pass laws to make changes. All the VLRC is doing is making recommendations to the Parliament regarding the changes. It has no power thereafter. So hopefully, again, that's alerting you to what will be a limitation on the VLRC's influence to change the law, in that it can put in a full 12 months, 24 months of work into making recommendations to law change. Once it's done that, it has no actual power to change the law. It is entirely up to the Parliament to decide on that. Okay, so that's a really important note to remember. Do not be writing that the VLRC changes the law. It does not. Okay, then we have our strengths and weaknesses of the VLRC. As the government, the government generally asks the VLRC to investigate particular areas of law, and hence they are most likely to be wanting to know from the VLRC's report how they should change the law. Okay, so that's a strength. If the government have asked, or the Parliament has asked the VLRC to look into a reform in the law, generally what they're wanting is how to go about. They've already decided they want to change it. What they want from the VLRC is how to go about it. A weakness, though, is that the VLRC can only investigate issues referred to it by the government or minor community law reform issues. The VLRC basically do two 2 projects a year, one that from the Attorney General and one a community one if they've been given permission to do it. So there's not, although they're very busy and working endlessly, and if you go onto their website, there's whole pages of reports that they've written for recommendations, it's still quite limited in actually how much it's able to do. Okay, another strength of the VLRC, it can measure community views on areas of investigation by holding consultations and receiving public submissions and then reflecting on those recommendations from the public. This should increase the likelihood of the government implementing its recommendations because to maintain and increase voter support, they're going to want to do what the people want them to do. So their laws politically, it's a good idea for their laws to reflect the views of the people. However, as we've already discussed, a weakness is that there is no obligation for the government to implement anything. Another strength, again, we've talked about it, it is independent of Parliament and political parties, so it remains objective and unbiased in whatever it decides. But a weakness is, as I mentioned before, it can take between 12 and 24 months for them to complete an investigation from start to finish. So it's not exactly a quick turnaround if it's a law we need desperately quickly changed. Strength, it has the power to make recommendations on relatively minor legal issues without any reference from the Attorney General. Okay, so the first step in the process is the Attorney General gives the VLRC the reference for this is what you are going to look into. However, on minor ones, the strength of the VLRC is that if they don't get from the Attorney General, they can come to their own conclusion and decide on one themselves. But again, weakness, they're limited in resources, so they can't undertake a lot of investigations into minor issues. So they pick and choose. Strength, statistics suggest that the VLRC can be highly influential on the Victorian Parliament. All or some of its recommendations are adopted in approximately 70% of cases. So 70% of reports that go from the VLRC to the Victorian Parliament recommending law reform are acted upon. So 70% is pretty strong kind of influence. But a weakness, the VLRC are only ever recommending changes to the Victorian law, not the Commonwealth law, as we have already discussed. All right, so there are our strengths and weaknesses, remembering that we need to be able to evaluate. So we need to know these strengths and weaknesses of the VLRC's ability to influence law reform. There was 3 options for examples of VLRC reports and recommendations: contempt of court, adoption and neighbourhood disputes. I recommended neighbourhood disputes and in a quick survey yesterday, the numbers were suggesting that's what most of you are going with, so that's the one that I have summarised. So the actual project is about neighbourhood tree disputes. So this is the instance where people live next door to each other. There's a great big whatever tree up against the fence and it drops all its mess and its branches over into next door, and they're sick of it because it clogs up the pool and it gets in their gutters, and the roots of the tree are coming underneath the fence and they're putting cracks in the swimming pool or cracks in the foundations of the house, and it's terrible. The tree's got to go, but there is no way the owner of the tree is getting rid of it. So we have a neighbourhood dispute. And it can have a lot of impact. If they're the kind of things that's happening to your house and your backyard, that's pretty distressing. It's also going to cost a lot of money, and you really want to get it sorted out. But not all neighbours get on all of the time, and some neighbours don't get on any of the time. So this is what the Neighbourhood Tree Disputes report by the VLRC was about. So under the Victorian Law Reform Commission Act 2000, the VLRC has the power to initiate some of its own projects without a reference from the Attorney General of Victoria. These projects must be relatively minor legal issues of general community concern, and they are known as community law reform projects. So the tree dispute is a community law reform project. The VLRC received inquiries directly from the community about changes to the law. They were also advised by the DSCV, which is the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria, that tree disputes were consistently brought to them by the community because the neighbours could not work it out. They needed help. And that tree disputes are surprisingly common and can be a source of ongoing disagreement and tension between neighbours. So why was this reform needed? The law in relation to tree disputes in Victoria is difficult to find and use, so that's one thing. There is no single act of parliament relating to tree disputes. Instead, there are various state and local laws that relate to vegetation, heritage, environment, planning and fences, so no law or regulation anywhere that with the title Neighbourhood tree disputes. The processes to resolve tree disputes are confusing and can be expensive. People aren't sure of their rights or responsibilities regarding to trees on private land. So going back to my example of the next door neighbour with the tree coming through, what rights does that person have whose house, swimming pool, etc. is being destroyed by the next door neighbour's tree? What rights does the owner of the tree have? What responsibilities does the owner of the tree have? People don't know this. It's not written anywhere. Information is hard to find. Disputes therefore often remain unresolved. It just goes on and on and on, and relations between neighbours just get worse and worse and worse, and damage that the tree may or may not be causing is getting worse. And finally, if you do want to do anything about it, you might need to find you have to go to court, and that's really expensive and really time consuming, and there's no clear precedent. There's no clear certainty of how the case is going to end up for you. So ultimately, the law needed to be clearer and there needed to be a better process to resolve tree disputes between neighbours. So the VLRC took this on and began with community consultation. Community members, and this is what they found out from the community. Community members found it hard to resolve neighbourhood tree disputes because the law is confusing. They don't know who to go to for help. The law is unclear because there's too many planning laws and local laws that overlap. So you've got your state laws and your local council laws and they're overlapping, and which one do you follow? There's no clear process for resolving this dispute. Do we go to the Victorian Civil and do we go to VCAT? Do we go to the courts? Do we go to Resolute? Do I go to my lawyer? Do I just go next door and yell and scream at my neighbour? I don't know what to do. What are the remedies? How is this going to be resolved? Will they have to cut down their tree? Can they keep the tree but they have to pay for the damage to my house? What is it? What are the remedies? Very few people take legal action because it's too expensive and time consuming to go to court, but there is no easier, cheaper, reliable method. And they also found out that there was overwhelming support for the introduction of a new dedicated act or law to better help people resolve their disputes. So that's what the VLRC found out from the community. They put it all together. The VLRC came up with 63 recommendations. You don't need to know all 63, but it might be handy to know 2 or 3. And these are the 3 most pertinent. That the VLRC recommended to the Victorian Parliament that it introduce a new Neighbourhood Tree Disputes Act in Victoria to provide clarity to the law and guidance to the community on how to resolve tree disputes. They'd also recommended community education to help people understand the new Act, how to prevent disputes arising, how to resolve a dispute and what assistance is available. And they also very strongly recommended, and this is a really good one to learn, and remember that when disputes can't be settled informally, that VCAT should make decisions about tree disputes with the assistance of tree experts, such as arborists. Okay, so that's a really important recommendation. And it goes back to the community not knowing who or where to go if they can't settle the dispute otherwise. VLRC's recommendation is that place is VCAT. So they're the recommendations. So then what is the influence of this on law reform? Well, the Attorney General, so the report was given to the Attorney General. The Attorney General tabled the report in the Victorian Parliament in November 2019 and stated in Parliament that the government intended to implement the Commission's recommendations. Now, whether that's all 63 or 60 or 50, I don't know. I've looked on the government website to find this new law. It hasn't come about yet. It must be, I would say, in the writing stage, obviously with what's gone on with COVID since November 2019. Perhaps the neighbourhood tree disputes law is slightly on the back burner at the moment. But with regards to you writing about influence, you can suggest that the VLRC has had influence in this area of law reform because the Attorney General stated in Parliament that the government intended to implement the Commission's recommendations. So that is the VLRC influencing law reform in the area of neighbourhood tree disputes. And that is it.